MRES has taken a distinctly different view of renewable energy. If you think of the University of Minnesota, you think of research. And if you've talked to Lanny Schmidt or Roger Rum or any of the professors that are doing the lion's share of the deep research, they're doing it down here. MRES is not doing deep research. MRES said about 8 years ago, we want to look at small-scale, deployable platforms that don't take 10 years and patent lawyers to figure out how do we get it to the market. We really had no intention of doing that. What we wanted to do was look at what's out there and see what we could put together in today's technology to promote renewable energy. And so that's really what we're talking about. So if you're looking for really deep research that's going to enlighten you, you're going to be disappointed tonight, because what we're really going to do is just take what we know and see how well we can apply it. The campus is a small campus, 1 million square feet. We're part of the U of M system. We're the only public liberal arts campus in the state of Minnesota. We have about 1,800 students. I'd say we're aspiring to be a sustainable community. Another word you might use is a low-carbon community. We'll detail this out. All those acronyms are basically higher ed sustainability organizations. We're really trying to figure out how to use renewable combined heat and power to manage the carbon footprint. I don't know who did the introduction on your newsletter, but I did enjoy that acronym. But I hadn't ever quite put it together that way before. But we're also a land grant. The University of Minnesota is a land grant institution, and MRES is smack in the middle of western Minnesota, and certainly understand that we have obligations to our region. The campus wasn't always a public liberal arts campus. It started out actually as a American Indian school established by the Sisters of Mercy, and ran that way for about 10 years. And they basically, their students came from the reservations in North Dakota and South Dakota. Federal government took it over. The national policies changed about 3 years later, and this campus then migrated into the West Central School of Agriculture. And for about 40 years, functioned as the ag training school in western Minnesota. It had a really interesting calendar. The students were there in the summertime. They went home in the fall to help on the farm. They were there in the wintertime, and they went home in the spring to help on the farm. And that was the academic calendar for that school. With the change of national and state policies, agricultural education was then put into all of the public high schools, which pretty much took out the need for these dedicated ag schools. And so in 1960, this campus again switched to a public four-year school. So enough about the intros. This is higher education, not necessarily confined to this state, but I'm using the data that we know about this state. I simply define them as clouds, but certainly the public support has been going down, and I don't know that that's a decision that somebody is consciously saying we don't want to fund education. I just think the state has so many different funding problems that it simply has to give somewhere. And I think last year was the first time in the U's history that we actually have more revenue coming from student tuition than we do state support, which is a somber milestone for us, but nevertheless. And then the last one is one that I think we all need to pay attention to, and that is Moody's, the investment house, is basically saying, be careful. Education is expensive enough now. that if you invest too much in education, with our economic situation the way it is right now, you may not get the returns that you want. That's an ominous note also. It says to us we need to continue to provide high quality education, but we need to figure out how to do it without passing those costs on to students. That's a critical piece. And it's kind of a driver a little bit about why MRES is doing what it's doing. And I'll get all this doom and gloom stuff out of the way, and then we'll move into more exciting things. I'm sure you guys have looked at the websites on the Energy Information Administration. I'm not going to go through this other than if things stay status quo, that last paragraph basically says we could see a 43% increase in CO2 emissions by 2035. Now, a particularly pessimistic view of that is if you're jumping out of an airplane and you don't have a parachute, does it make much difference how fast you're going? At some point, we're going to cross over where it's sane, and something is going to have to happen. And I hope MRES is can provide an example of maybe things that can happen to slow that down. So MRES is a liberal arts campus. You don't get to just talk about kilowatt hours and pounds of steam production. In a liberal arts campus, you have to talk about other things too, like culture and society. And this came from Jay Stuller, and I'll just simply give this a little bit of a plug. Have you guys seen this? It's called The Electric Revolution. It's put out by the Galvin Electricity Initiative. It is very interesting reading. They basically are saying the way we have structured our electrical distributions in this country, we need to do the same thing that we did to the telephone industry 30 years ago to the electric industry now. And so it is probably controversial, but it's really interesting. I would advise you to look it up on the website. But his leading sentence in there was a quote from Thomas Paine in 1776, "A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right." And what Stuller was talking about is he was focused on how we produce and distribute electricity. I looked at that and said, yeah, but there's a much bigger picture out there. I just came from a national ASHE conference, which is Association of Sustainability in Higher Education. And we had an international speaker from Costa Rica who basically took us all to task about energy justice and energy equality. And so that first sentence up there, we are so used of us, 5% of the world's population, using 25% of the world's fossil fuels, that it feels right. But in reality, from a global perspective, it's probably wrong. And so that was his point, and it makes you stop and think. You know, we made this country great on cheap energy, but our challenge now is to keep it great without using all of that energy. And then certainly economic sustainability. One of the things that Thomas Paine was particularly irked about was the monarchy. The colonists were dependent on the monarchy, but it became obvious that the king was extracting more than his fair share of fees off the colonists. And Paine was looking at that and saying that was money that really should be going to build the infrastructure of the colonies, and it shouldn't be going overseas. Now, here's where I'm going to get into trouble. Can you think of any modern day corollaries of that? I'm not going to go any further on that thought. So welcome to the campus. The Morris campus is in western Minnesota. We used to think, it's 3 hours from here, we used to think that we were somewhat isolated and probably would have given anything to be able to slide the campus a couple hours east, just simply because we would be closer to the urban corridors. I think we've had a chance to rethink that. And that is, I don't want to offend anyone, but the urban corridor is not in the center of the best wind and biomass resources of the state. As a matter, you guys are on the periphery. Morris is probably right in the center of what we would say is a good combination of very class 3 wind or better and plenty of moisture and plenty of ag production. If you go farther to the west, you get more wind but less moisture. Come farther east, you probably get more moisture, but you have less wind resources. So we've come to understand that maybe where we are is just right. And looking at strategic resources, those concentric rings, one is, if you can't read it, one is corn. The large green circle is the corn production in the Midwest. The red circle is the wind, class 3 wind areas. So what we did about 4 or 5 years ago was, some of you might call it assessing the assets that we have in our region. 10 years ago, in Morris, we have a USDA soils lab. Can you hear me? Do we need to be loud? Can we turn this up anymore? Or? All right. Sorry. We have a USDA soils lab in Morris. We have University of Minnesota Experiment Research Station, which is primarily focused on agriculture. And we have a 4-year liberal arts campus. And 10 years ago, you would have said, well, what do these three things have in common? And you might have had a tough time trying to figure out what it might be. It has come basically over the last 5 to 7 years. Forgive the pun, we do have a bond. It's carbon. The Soils Lab has been working on carbon sequestration in the soils for probably 15 years. The West Central Research and Outreach, the ag production people, have been working on growing carbon for about the last 15 years. And the Morris campus has come to understand that we derive a lot of our energy from carbon. And so we have focused a great deal on asset mapping of carbon. We don't have coal in Minnesota. We don't have oil in Minnesota. We don't have natural gas in Minnesota. So that pretty much rules out most of the traditional sources of what we think of carbon. So we really looked at this and said, well, okay, what do we have? And we started doing some calculations on the biomass that we have in our regions. And we calculated that if we could somehow figure out how to use plant material for energy, we'd need about 9,000 tons of plant material per year to provide the thermal energy for the campus. And initially we said, gee, 9,000 tons, that's a lot. How far did we have to go to get 9,000 tons? So we had the people in Grand Forks, the EERC people, do an assessment of the biofuel production in Stevens County. And Stevens County is the county we're in, and it's a small county. And this was back about 6 years ago. The annual corn stover, in other words, the material left after the farmer has harvested the corn stover production in Stevens County was estimated to be 660,000 tons per year. That was an aha moment. Oh, maybe there's a lot of carbon out there, then we just haven't been thinking about it in terms of carbon. So we did the same kind of thing with wind. We knew we were miserable in the wintertime, but you know, you just have to sit down and figure out why you're miserable, and that's because the wind's always blowing. Actually, the wind resources are better in the fall and spring than they are in the winter. But I'm mapping these out, looking at, well, what are they? We came back with really two very robust natural resources in our area. So that started us then to talk about, well, so we have natural resources that we may be able to substitute, but how do we do that? How do we understand what is and what is not sustainable? And certainly the ethanol folks have gotten into that one up to their eyebrows about, is it sustainable, is it not sustainable? We wanted to really look at, and it's not, the jury's still out yet on the biomass too, because there's still more research that has to be done on how much carbon can we harvest? And is there too much carbon being produced in today's genetic varieties? Is there not enough? So there's still long-range studies that have to happen there. But certainly understanding what's sustainable, what's not, what's manageable, what's not, and then understanding what's possible. And I think that's the hardest question of all, because you really have to stretch sometimes. Sometimes the best way to find out what's possible is to go ask an 18-year-old freshman who just walked on the campus. They have sometimes the most uninhibited ideas about what's possible. If I go ask our heating plant engineers, well, what's possible, I'm pretty sure I know what they're going to tell me, because they've been using what's been possible in their mind for the last 20 years. So if you ask the investor-owned utility what's possible, I'm pretty sure they'll give you a defined answer. So what we really needed to do was push that envelope a little bit. That got us into a conversation called distributed generation. And so that's where we started moving. But we needed to do this under the auspices of we're not a utility. We have no desire to be a utility. But we needed to be a learning process in this too. So how does it fit within the curriculum? How does it fit in the educational community? Identifying the stakeholders, the students, the faculty, the alumni, the governing board, and one that's not often put down there, but one is there now, region. Region is very important in the discussion in distributed generation. Actually, region is very important when you talk about renewable energy, because most of the time renewable energy is local. So building in that part that wasn't there before was region. How do we now involve our region in this? And then the other one that's really hard, risk tolerant or risk adverse. MRES definitely took some risks. We have bumps and bruises to show for it. But we looked at it and said status quo is not where we wanted to be. And so we started this down this road in 2002. 2001, actually. That's the first conversation we had, because some of you with long memories would remember that natural gas prices went from $3 a million BTU in 2001 in January to $10 per million BTU. It bankrupted the utilities budget. Totally wiped out, because it had never done that before. We had never reserved for those kinds of dollars. And so that was another part of this discussion is, whoa. I went to the chancellor and said, can I put a fuel surcharge on the diplomas? And the chancellor said, absolutely not. So at that point we said, we've got to figure out, is there any way we have, going back up to that question, what's manageable? We weren't in any kind of a management position at that point in time, and we said we need to figure out how to get there. So it really requires thinking differently. Most of us, I think, we understand that energy needs to be conserved. MRES spent $2 million on energy conservation work in the last 2 years on this campus. We also understand that energy is purchased, because that's what we do with energy. We go out and buy it. We get a bill at the end of each month, just like everyone else here, except the people who just put the photovoltaic up. That got us back to this distributed generation discussion again, and that's produced. Where is it written that electrons have to travel 300 miles before you can use them? So we then started looking at this. That was the final catalyst in the discussion that said maybe we should put up our own wind turbine, of which we did in 2005. So produced, who produces it? We said maybe we should produce it. And we said maybe our region should produce the thermal energy that we need. And so that has been a basic understatement of what MRES has been doing. Certainly everything is capital intensive, traditional versus real. I don't care what plant you're building. If it's producing energy, it's expensive. Just bottom line. Even photovoltaics are expensive. But the issue is, so yes, there's capital costs involved. Do we use the traditional way of financing, and that is we have a company do it for us? Or do we look at distributed generation where we may own some of that, or we may have an investor that owns some of that? In other words, rethinking about how these things are financed. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. The other thing that's always a problem for us is the return on investment is driven by externalities. So what's the first thing I look at when I go out and say, I'm going to buy some corn stover for thermal conversion? What's the first thing I look at? Obviously what the price the farmer is willing to sell it to me, but that doesn't mean I'm going to buy it yet, because I need to go out and always benchmark it against the cost of fossil fuel. I can't buy that corn stover if it's cheaper for me to use fossil fuel. And the fossil fuel prices are always, they're commodity prices, and so you're always looking out there. It's a liability, but it's also an opportunity. Because when fossil fuel prices go up, that's when you can capitalize on making sure you have alternative sources. And the other thing I want to say, to be very clear, in our region, and we've said this from day one, we are not looking for the cheapest source of fuel we can find. We will always benchmark buying our biomass against the equivalent cost of natural gas. And we believe that it's only fair to be able to give that farmer the same value that you'd be giving a petroleum company for the BTUs. So we're buying BTU value. And what that does is it puts money back into the region. It creates jobs. The biomass plant, when we're fully running, should create about 6 jobs in the region. So because we've consciously said we want to stay on BTU equivalents in terms of costs. Now, you as taxpayers might have an issue with that, but we think that's what we need to do to promote the stability in our region. Renewable energy is not in my business plan. Read this. I won't spend any more time talking about that. Just read this. It will tell you that our traditional investments, well, what they accurately describe in here is we have an energy system right now that pits stockholders against ratepayers. That's how our system works right now. The inequality is the stockholders can go anywhere they want. They can go and invest in somebody else's company. The ratepayers can't. And this book basically screams about equity for ratepayers. So financing is always a problem. Credit is really tight. Nothing is happening really to speak of right now. You can actually go out and talk to the wind turbine companies right now because they aren't selling wind turbines, because the credit crunch has hurt them too. So you have to be really creative. We're going to put up one more turbine later this year, and the university is simply doing an internal loan. we're bonding for it. It's the only way we can find the dollars to do it. The other ones, power purchase agreements, traditional feed-in tariffs. Feed-in tariffs are not looked kindly upon in some of the more traditional energy markets. What I would suggest to you, I won't spend time talking about them, Ontario Power Authority, OPA. Google them. The whole province of Ontario, just a few hundred miles north of us, switched over and does feed-in tariffs for the whole province. They're doing it for wind, they're doing it for PV. It's a really fascinating read. So if you want to check on feed-in tariffs, it may debunk some of the things you hear people say about feed-in tariffs. The rest of these are pretty much the tax advantage private equity is the 1603s or the tax credits or whatever else is out there. Now, right now, the 1603s are due to expire in December. That's going to be even more bad news for the renewable energy industry if that happens. But we'll see. I don't know where Washington's going to go on that one. The other one that I want to just simply talk about briefly, and that's the hybrid LLC donors. We've done some initial studies. We've looked at this. With the economy where it is and with the stock market where it is, there's really a golden opportunity here if we could just figure out how to get to it. And that is, I'll just be specific here. We'll take a hypothetical. Morris wants to put up a third wind turbine. If we would go to somebody local or somebody who knows us and come to them and say, we have a power purchase agreement for 20 years. We'll guarantee you X revenue. You have whatever tax credits you have at your disposal. You own the turbine. We sign the power purchase agreement with you. You have a revenue stream. We have a source of renewable energy. We could provide a much better, much more stable investment opportunity for somebody in our region than what they could find on Wall Street. Given what seems like, and I'm not talking to you, but what seems like the public's less enthusiasm for investing in public education, I think universities are going to have to really seriously look at some of this kind of stuff. Revenue producing investments probably need to be private partner kind of relationships. Investors aren't going to build a classroom, but they sure would invest in PV, or they sure would invest in wind. And somehow I think we've got to figure that out. The other thing that Morris has gotten very aggressive on is, right now Morris has over $3 million, not quite $3 million, of DOE and National Energy Technology Lab grants to do research. Based on the facilities that you, the public, have invested in on that campus, we've leveraged those facilities to bring in $3 million, and we got a really interesting grant we're submitting right now for more than that. This is just, you guys, if you've looked at where we are in the national energy policy, this is the problem. I just talked to the ASHE conference, which had people from 50 different states. You cannot come up with a power purchase agreement or a policy that's universal. Each state has its own laws and regulations, and so there are 50 different interpretations. I don't know if you know Desire, the website. If you haven't been on it, write it down. They do a great job of tracking all of the state requirements and the state mandates and the state's policies. So what are we doing in Morris? If I can make this work. This is where we were in 2005. We started, wind turbine came online, so that's the first wind turbine. It's a 1.6 megawatt Vestas. It's behind the meter, distributed generation. It's on our property. The lines come to our campus. We use the power first. If it's anything's over and above that, then it spills out onto the grid. The way the regulations are written in this state and actually federally, this project would have never happened if we had to put it out on the investor-owned utilities grid and move it to the campus and take it off. There are so many wheeling charges and fees and things involved in it, it would have killed it. It was cheaper for us to build a 3/4 mile long transmission line from the turbine to our campus than it was to try and do any power moving through the utilities lines. So we essentially just did behind the meter. The next bar is the biomass plant. That's 80% of our thermal and heating loads, and I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. That's a steam turbine that we're becoming a combined heat and power plant right now. We also have an absorption chiller. So what that means is we take biofuels, we gasify them, we make steam, we use the steam to turn the turbine to produce electricity, which produces not quite as much as the wind turbine does. But then after we produce the electricity from that turbine, then we take the steam and use it to either heat the buildings in the wintertime or through the absorption chiller, cool the buildings in the summertime. So now we have a year-round load and it's combined heat and power. All today's technology, nothing exotic here. Gasification is probably the most risky piece of this, but it's combining wind, which is not dispatchable. In other words, we can't control when wind is, with biomass, which is stored energy. And then starting to figure out how do we make these two platforms work together. And actually, we were surprised. They work better together than we anticipated.
So on your chart, I see that going, the total goes down by 2013, it's lower than earlier.
Yep.
That means you're going to have some conservation in there, right?
Yes.
And then it goes below zero, so you're actually generating some power if that's
Potentially, yeah. I have to be careful on how I say this. The temptation was to say, well, gee, we'll get to be carbon neutral. We're not carbon neutral. We never will be carbon neutral because the wind doesn't blow all the time. And the state regulations, the way they're currently written, any power that goes to the grid, we must sell the RECs, the green credits, with that power. In other words, the utility gets those. So we can't claim them. So we'll never be carbon neutral, but the irony is we probably, with the second wind turbine, we'll be at a point where we produce more energy than we use. But it's not all about energy. It's about culture. And remember, this is a campus filled with kids who like to ask questions. And it's about lifestyles. It's about local foods. We require our food service contractor to buy local foods. They must put it in their contract and they must serve it on our campus. Again, stability of the region. And it's about kids, students, excuse me. Clearly everything we're doing so that students can understand they can live in a low carbon community, and you know what? It really doesn't feel any different than the old community. So if we can get that point across, personal opinion is sometime during the next 30 years, the graduates coming off this campus are going to have to deal with a carbon constrained environment. Whether you believe that or not, that's opinion. But what we're saying is hopefully we can give them at least some basic tools to understand you can deal with a carbon constrained environment and maybe even prosper. How am I doing on time? Solar thermal. We put in 32 panels last summer. Solar Skies, Randy Hagan, if you know Randy. He's in Alex right now. That's where they're making them. So those go to are pools. And I just pulled this off this morning. There's the diagram. It's pretty simple. It's a circulating pump. When it gets above a certain temperature, the pumps kick on. It goes through the heat exchanger. The pool water goes off to the right, and then the return goes back into the solar collectors. It's not sophisticated, but it works. And then there's the temperature range for this is a typical solar kind of thing for yesterday. So we're capturing that heat. We're pumping it into the pool. That's the pool it's going into. And then on our sister campus, the West Central Research and Outreach Center, they're doing what I would say some cutting-edge work in residential systems. This is, they have evacuated tube collectors, and the photo on the right is a picture of a residential scale absorption chiller. There's not many of those around right now. But the significance of this is on the hottest day of the year, they're capturing the most heat from those solar flat plate thermal collectors, which is exactly what they need for the absorber to provide the cooling for that building. It's this kind of parallel relationship that makes it work so well. Yeah?
They're actually evacuated tubes, not flat plate.
Yeah, these are evacuated tubes. And a good point. Sorry. The evacuated tubes are really required because you need the delta T to make that absorber work. And the evacuated tubes get a lot hotter. Yeah?
Yeah, what kind of temperature range is a typical operating?
Oh, you know, and Mike Reese is the one who could answer that one.
Sorry.
I know they run about 100 degrees higher than the flat plates. So they must be right on the 200 and some. So a really interesting system. I think this system has lots of potential down the road. Think of the cutting of the demand charges for the electrical utility. Suddenly you're taking that big chunk of which drives most of the surplus generating capacity that utility has, and you just lopped it off. Because these are now taking the load for those hot days. Gasification. You cannot, well, you probably can, but you'll be sorry. Take high mineral content ag fuel, biofuels, and try and burn them in a traditional wood or coal boiler. The fuel bed temperatures in those are in the neighborhood of 24 to 2,900 degrees. Corn stover especially has high silica content in it. If you try and move corn stover through those temperatures, you'll volatilize the silica. It will go into the flue and it will go down to the boiler and it will condense on the first thing that finds it's under 2,300 degrees, which happens to be your boiler tubes. So it will destroy your boiler. So we didn't learn that the hard way. We knew that we couldn't run at those temperatures. So we started looking at a process called gasification. The simplistic concept of gasification is your Weber kettle. It has those little air doors down at the bottom, and if you want to cool it down, you close them off. Gasification is oxygen-starved combustion. You do not let all the air into that fuel bed. And what happens then is you produce an intermediary gas. For the chemists in the room, instead of the equation going all the way to the right, you've now stopped it about midpoint, and you're now producing the NOx, which is because you're using air. You're getting hydrogen and you're getting carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. Hydrogen and carbon monoxide are flammable. That is our fuel source that we replace natural gas with. Now that's low quality. It's probably a third to a quarter of the BTU value of natural gas. But we can treat it just like natural gas and we can run it into a boiler. This is our fuel bunker. It's a walking floor and it's all tied into the gasifier. So when the gasifier needs fuel, it simply turns on and we push more fuel into the gasifier. That's actually inside the gasifier. Obviously, it's cooled down right there. But it's just a walking floor, incline grate, atmospheric pressure. It's a simple system. We wanted it simple because in the back of our mind, someday this may be deployable in other communities. Okay? So there's the boiler. That picture of that residential scale absorption chiller, that's what a 600-ton absorption chiller looks like. That will carry about 60 to 70% of the campus chilled water load. We use the steam from the gasifier to run the absorption chiller. It's a closed circuit. The condensate comes back to the boiler. The significance of this is prior to this, we had, well, we still have them. We have electric-driven chillers that we have for backup. But our demand charges for the year were based on the hottest day of the year when those electric chillers were running. This summer, we fuel switched. We use the absorption chiller as our primary chilled water source, and so remember talking about lopping off the peak demand? I guess right now we saved about $100,000 on peak demand charges. We're still looking at the data right now. The steam turbine, that's the steam turbine right there. It's back pressure, so we'll come in at 280 pounds. It leaves at 15, but we produce almost 400 kilowatts of power in that process. And then another little thing that we looked at is water. We used to use city water for our heating plant. But at the same time, in our heating plant, we had footings that went down below the water table. So we have sump pumps sitting down there that we're pumping groundwater out of the footing area and simply into the storm sewer. Literally more than 1 million gallons. And so what we did was we diverted that flow. We're already paying to pump it. So now we put in sediment tanks, we put in water softening, we put in iron filter, and then we put in an RO unit. All of that water now comes from the groundwater. It's not city water, and we now do almost no chemical treatment in our boilers or our cooling towers because we're capturing that water and reusing it. We also, a side story, students, city water has, in MRES, has iron content. Some students actually think it tastes bad. We put RO units in every residence hall floor and suggested strongly to those students, don't bring plastic water bottles on this campus anymore. Use the city water through the RO because recycling plastic is a problem. Culture. Okay, well, it's not all just easy. That's what happens when you're not paying attention and you get corn stover too hot. That's about a 12-inch long slag ash. The silica starts to essentially glaze, and in the thermal conversion of corn stover, there's something called an alkalinity index, and if you're above 1, it makes the ash sticky. Well, corn stover is about 1.2. Corn stover is a really nasty fuel source, but we have lots of it. So what we really are working on right now on the research side of this is how do you either finesse the gasifier to keep those bed temperatures low enough so we don't slag, or how do we blend fuels to bring that alkaline index down? And so happens prairie grass has a number of about 0.6. So blend 50% prairie grass and 50% corn stover, and now you have an alkalinity index of, I don't know, 7 something, 8, which works a lot better. So we are due to put a report out next spring that will document everything that we've done in the last 3 years. The wind turbine. And here's the cutting edge research that West Rock is doing right now, taking the power from the wind turbine, using electrolysis with water to make hydrogen. And they will then, the next step, and they're doing the commissioning on that right now. The next step, hopefully by January, is add a Haber-Bosch process to that, pull the nitrogen out of the air, combine it with the hydrogen that they just produced, and make ammonia. So it's a renewable source of ammonia that doesn't use natural gas as its base fuel stock. It's not ready for prime time yet, but that's what the University of Minnesota is supposed to do, I think, is look at these things. Okay? A business plan for sustainability. I have the site, well, the second turbine that we're going to put up goes right here. The first one is right there. I have another site with all the fatal flaw studies done, all of the ground surveys done, the documents ready to go for a third turbine. The credit market is giving me problems, but if I can ever find a way to get this financed, that turbine is nothing but a revenue stream. It won't necessarily provide any more power to the campus. It's just going to the grid. And whatever we make off that comes back to control campus costs. The other piece that I want to make sure you understand from the standpoint of wind turbines or photovoltaics or solar, you make that capital investment. You now have a power purchase agreement for the next 20 years. I can tell you right now what the campus is going to be paying for 70% of its electricity in the year 2029. I know that right now. That's called cost avoidance. And I also know that number is going to be way less than what it will be off the grid in 2029. That brings down the cost to the campus. Remember the concern about controlling our costs. It's one way for us to do it. We're managing it. We're trying to use it to control costs. We also are trying to do as much conservation as we can. We put $2 million in an ESCO contract, zero emission vehicles, LED lights. The paybacks are horrendous on the outdoor lights right now, but we needed the data. They'll get better. Not all the energy stuff is fun. We do 30-some% of our campus waste stream is recycled, and that's 30% by weight. And that means you have to capture it, you sort it, you segregate it, and then you find markets for it. But that's what you have to do. Most of our passenger fleets are all hybrid. My dream, we have excess wind. What I'd really like to see is at night, when our power demand comes down, we have a bunch of electric vehicles that we sit there and plug in and charge all night, i.e. storage. Because that power coming from those turbines is worth a lot more to me than it is to the utility. Knowing we have an environmental master plan that says where are the places that we should be looking at capturing our local energy. This is just a solar radiance map. Smart grids. We're about to do an RFP on smart grids, putting smart meters on our buildings. Our local investor-owned utility has tariffs filed for time of day charging and next day rates. So here's the scenario on smart grids at MRES. We look at tomorrow's weather forecast. We look at the temperature. We look at the wind speed. We look at the price of power from the investor-owned utility tomorrow. We look at the price of biomass, and we then look at the price of natural gas. And then we decide which platforms are we going to run tomorrow based on those inputs. That's where I would love to see MRES in the next 3 years. This is simply a diagram of our energy production platforms, including there's the public grid, there's the natural gas. So there's the wire and pipe. But then everything else are systems that we manage within our platform behind the meter. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to keep moving through here. I think this is probably, if you remember any slides that I've talked about tonight and you're thinking differently about energy, this is the one you got to remember. One, you'd still have to work with your local power providers. Somehow, they've got to understand what you're doing. You need to understand where they're going. And sometimes it's not a fun conversation, but nevertheless, it has to be had. What's in it for the educational outcomes? Again, I don't think anyone in the state wants to see our university systems become public or private or public utilities. Does it create local wealth? I think that is a critical question. We are benefiting from a lot of wind right now, and it's situated in North Dakota. Is that what the state legislature had in mind when they passed the renewable energy targets? I don't know. You'll have to ask them. Does it create local opportunities? Does it build regional stability? Triple bottom line. Will it bring down the cost? That's one that I'm paranoid about. Will it somehow bring down costs, or at least hold costs, so that we keep education as a right and not a privilege? Does it teach students how to excel in a new carbon-constrained environment? I hear some industries saying dealing with carbon is just going to be way too expensive. Somewhere in the back of my mind, there's a capitalist system. And if it's way too expensive, I want to be the one selling them, whatever it is. No, I want our students to be the ones selling them, whatever it is. It's just another business opportunity. And does it substitute natural resources for declining state and federal aid? We intend to make revenues to produce money on those wind turbines that will offset some of the loss that we're seeing from state allocations. Quickly, risks. Public institutions are always risk adverse. Most industries are risk adverse. But put yourself into 2035 and say, are we taking the lowest, least risk route by status quo? I don't know that any of us can answer that right now, but I really have some suspicions that the power plants that we use right now at 2035 may have a quite different liability associated with them then than what they have right now. Long-term benefits of what did Cool call it, on renewable systems, no fuel surcharges. So I'm going to close. We're using natural resources, those are solar plates, to move towards a low-carbon community. We anticipate we will cut 80% of our fossil fuel use, and that we will see an 80% reduction in carbon emissions from fossil fuels for this campus. And I'm done.
Let's take questions till about 10 after.
Okay? Yeah. That's a really good question. We just did a renovation of a historic building, and I think the numbers right now we're too short of being on a platinum, 58 instead of 60. We looked at geothermal, and I think geothermal really is a good solution, but not for this campus. Because this campus, you, the people, have already invested in a district heating system for this campus. All of the steam pipes, the chilled water lines, everything is already embedded and goes to all of the buildings. If we went to geothermal, we would kind of be not using some of that investment because we'd probably be doing more building by building operations. And so we looked at it and said, no, we already have the investment in district heating. We probably should stay on that track. If I were starting over, you bet, I'd look at geothermal really quick. Good question, yeah.
In your classes, the class meeting, discuss anything about renewable energy standards?
Oh yeah. We have components of the sustainabilities in all of our divisions. So we have economics, and we're talking about RECs and the value of RECs there. In our social sciences, we're talking about social justice. In the sciences, we're talking about measuring just what are those quantities. Well, how many RECs? And so we try and build that whole conversation throughout the campus. Yes?
Did you look into other different types of biomass? I mean,
Oh,
other than farm storage?
yeah, another good question. The grant that we got a $1.8 million grant from USDA because they wanted to know the thermal mass balances and the emissions footprints. And they funded putting a real-time continuous emissions monitoring on this plant. So anything we're running, we have real-time values on the emissions on the flue stream. They wanted to know the emissions of corn stover, they want to know the emissions of wheat straw, they want to know the emissions of wood chips, they want to know the emissions of, what am I missing? Soybean stubble, and there's another one out there. Wood, and, oh, cobs was the other one. So by next March, we have to give them all of that data on those fuel stocks. MPCA wants to know that too, by the way. Okay.
Well, I was going to ask about that same issue with the toxic ash that's left behind.
Sure.
And just the environmental pollution that can happen when you do gasification. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's a really good question, and we're actually in this USDA grant, we contracted with the soils lab to do all of our ash analysis, but we also send it out to Hazen too. So we're starting to now monitor. We just commissioned the plant last week. 24 months is what it took, but we got it commissioned last week. So we'll start running those fuel samples next week, where we start then collecting those ash and analyzing them. Really, our intent is keep those fuel bed temperatures low. We don't want to be above 1100 degrees in that fuel bed because we want the minerals to stay in that ash. We want the silica to stay in that ash. We want that ash to be a nutrient and not a landfill. And so that's what we have to prove next. If we end up, we have to landfill that ash, then we've really failed significantly in what we intended to do.
Maybe you can answer this question. How do you feel that your sustainability education of these students is standing up against the misinformation from the perverse corporatist media?
Let me just say that I think our mission is to provide an informed citizenry. And if we can do that,
Do you feel successful?
I would be feeling very successful, yes.
Where are you on the graph?
Oh, I think we have a long way to go yet. Although, students are wonderful. You sometimes have to be careful what you ask for, but I think every year they come on campus with higher expectations about what we should be doing in renewable energy. But so, and that's nice. They keep the pressure on, yeah.
Along those lines, are there any metrics in place to track if this is a valuable recruitment tool for students and faculty?
Well, we look at that. Yeah, if you look at surveys, I think a high school student, sustainability is important to them. Sure.
Are you seeing numbers yet that reflect that?
Yeah, actually our numbers are increasing. Yep. Well, part of that, we don't know whether it's because they like sustainability or they can't find a job. Time will tell.
What kind of luck are you having in finding markets for recycling? I'm asking that because I've been working for years on Ramsey County to recycle more plastics. I mean, polystyrene is just eminently recyclable. You can recycle hundreds and hundreds of times, but you know it's mostly air. So they just couldn't justify trucking it to Chippewa Falls, the nearest plant, to actually recycle it.
I'm proud of our students. Our recycling program is run 100% by students. They collect it, they sort it, we have compactors, they compress it, and they go out and find the markets. And they basically make it a self-supporting operation. It pays their wages. And I couldn't be any happier with that outcome.